Well, welcome back to the Pastor's Podcast. Pastor Scott here with Pastor Jim.
Good morning.
Or evening, or whenever you're listening to us. It's
good point.
It's not even morning when we're recording this.
No, it's not. You're right.
I feel like that's a church thing, though, right? Like
Yeah.
anytime I am in the church building and I see somebody, I want to say good morning. You know, it's a Christmas Eve evening service, and
Right.
people show up, and all you say is just good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Right. Should say good day. Good day. That covers the whole.
That's right.
Sunshine. Yeah.
That's right. Well, I hope that you have been enjoying the History of Cornerstone series we've been doing as much as I have. I know a number of you have really been enjoying this. Looking forward to the next episodes coming out. Jim, everybody just wants to listen to you tell stories over and over again. It really is a blessing.
I love it. We're missing a lot of stories. There's stories. Anytime there's people gather, I think, before God, there's going to be stories.
There's stories to tell.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. And
Yeah.
great stories to tell.
Oh, great ones. Yeah.
Well, we're continuing with the third volume of this. If you haven't listened to the first couple, I'd encourage you to go back and kind of listen in order. But it's your podcast app. You can do whatever you want. I'm not gonna hold you to that. But there are two earlier iterations of this, and so we've been recounting this history of the church from its inception in 1901, up originally through in the first couple of decades, and then into the 20s and 30s last time. And that's basically where we're going to pick up. We're going to pick up in 1940-ish.
Yes.
And discuss the war years and the post-war years, which were really formative in the life of the church. So Jim said this is more involved. You got some notes here.
I have notes. This is the boom era for the church. So
okay.
I needed notes just to kind of keep everything before me and give it some sort of organization. I think there's just a lot going on. The main change was in a pastor who came at that time and stayed a long time. He was here until 1970. 1948, right after the war. And I should back up just a touch. The war years were difficult years for America because all the energy and all the everything that was produced was going to the war effort. So it was a difficult time to just live here. We were coming out of the Depression. There was not a lot of money, but then we hit the war, and suddenly all the unemployed people are needed. They become soldiers. Women become workers. They take the jobs that men were doing. They begin to build airplanes, bombs, all the things that you need for war. And so suddenly, within a couple of years, everybody who's an adult and has eyes and hands is employed. And they're either in the military or doing something that's related to the war. And then you still have your grocery store and your car repair. But it just the economy and the country just did a flip flop.
Do you have any sense for how that impacted the church? I mean, I imagine you're going from so many people out of work, struggling, things like that, to everybody being in work, but also for a very specific purpose.
Yeah, and also I think there's a spiritual element. People were scared, and so people who probably might not have, in a prosperous environment where things were normal, not thought about their lives being at stake or something like that, began to come into the church, and the church grew very rapidly during those days, and with many converts, many people coming in, either trying to figure out about God or having been recently converted and becoming believers. So it was an interesting time for the church. It was also an interesting time because the dynamics changed in another way. West LA was becoming a center of a lot of things. So, for instance, planes were built at what we call now Clover Field, Santa Monica Airport. Douglas Aircraft, I think, had moved there, and they were building warplanes. And all the men were at war, so who was building the planes? Women took those jobs and began, Rosie the Riveter type positions began to open up all over. And many women that I met in this church, older women when I came here, had been working for Douglas or other companies around. And they were some of the first women in their families who had ever worked at a job. And most of them loved it. They were excited to get out and be able to help in the war effort. But it was also difficult because there were not many men around. They were all in the military. And so it was a very difficult time in the early days of the war.
So during those times, there was a lot of. Was that a time where West LA became, because of this manufacturing and things like that, became more and more of a hub? Was that the beginning of the aerospace focus in West LA? I mean, I know there's a bit of an aerospace history here.
Yes.
And this was the establishment of that.
Yes.
And so a lot of people were working a lot, but there was also a lot of fears, a lot of upheaval, a lot of unknown.
Yes. And there are many other factors. UCLA became a sort of a factory for chemists, people who were going into like building bombs, becoming managers. A lot of things that were designed for like normal society suddenly became focused on the war. So UCLA boomed. Everything boomed, and money was pouring in all directions. Anybody who could do anything was working, so there was almost no unemployment.
And so, was that really the first time that the church boomed in that sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you listen to the earlier podcast, you'll hear bits and pieces where we talk about the church is always financially struggling, borrowing money. There was a Christian institution in Los Angeles that loaned money to churches at very low interest rates so they could get going.
Yeah, that
was their purpose. And so that had been happening. And several loans had come over the last decades into the church to keep it afloat. And suddenly we were able to pay that back and change that. We were the number of people who had moved here to either work or go to college grew, and so that the church boomed and membership as well. And there was an interesting other issue, which was that people were very afraid, since one of the war fronts was with Japan, and we live right on the ocean. The potential for a Japanese submarine coming along and shooting at everybody or something like that. And there was a great fear of that. And I guess it actually happened once. There was apparently a submarine that fired a couple of rounds out somewhere and just scared everybody half to death. But that's as far as it ever went. But people who were here when I came told me about that. And they said, yes, we heard the cannons go off. We thought, oh my gosh, that's the Japanese. Everybody hide.
Oh man.
So it was a real fear to them, even though it was not an actual. It seems comical in retrospect.
No, it strikes me because I was thinking of this just the other day. You know, you see coverage of wars and battles and even urban centers being taken over. You know, even just the current Russia and Ukraine war, and the idea that this area, that where we live would be a front or even a potential front in a war, is so far from my imagination, right? It's so far from my lived experience.
Yes.
But in those times, it wasn't.
It was not at all.
It was a very real and palpable fear.
Yes, it was.
That people and people living and walking through and growing and deepening in their faith these were the felt fears and needs on the front of mind, I would assume.
Yes.
For many during that time.
And we forget, like Guam, the Battle of Guam.
Yeah.
One of the fears of that was that if the Japanese took Guam, that's a base that they could reach the western United States from for bombing or whatever. That would make us vulnerable. So that battle was far more important than I think people understood at the time. But yeah, that was critical. So yeah, it was a real possibility that the war would come to this kind of.
Was there a pastor that shepherded this church family through that era, or were they still cycling through different pastors during that time?
They were cycling through, but the pastor who came at that time, who really was the kind of the stabilizer of everything, was an interesting fellow, Dr. William Thomas. He came in 1948. This is post-war.
So post-war. Okay.
Yeah.
So things were kind of still cycling throughout the war. And I mean, I imagine there's not very many young male pastors available to fill pulpits across the country.
Right.
But after the war,
yes,
Dr. Thomas.
That's when he came. Yeah. Before the war, you're right. It was older pastors who were not eligible to go overseas.
Yeah.
And cycled through a few of them, and they didn't stay long. Post-war was an interesting time. People had been exposed to things they hadn't been exposed to before. They had much more of a world view and much less of a kind of a closed and narrow country view. So one of the issues that the church was very interested in was missionaries. People had been to all these countries and realized that nobody knew anything about Jesus in India or Vietnam or whatever. And they were concerned. And so the church, kind of as a single mind, really wanted to become involved in reaching out.
And so during that time, Dr. Thomas came.
Dr. Thomas came.
And he was a missionary, or?
No, he had wanted to be.
Okay.
And tried to, I believe it was in India where he went and found that he was not. That was not what he could do. He was just not able to do that somehow. I don't know what went wrong, but something went wrong, and he came back feeling very discouraged, and happened to find out that this position was open, and applied for it basically, and was hired, and was really a brilliant man, a great man, a good leader, and found his home here, and really just he came in. All these men came back from the war. Everybody was wanting to do something big to impact the world, and that's when the church became very dynamic, and a number of things began to happen.
So, thinking back, I mean, it's that era that Dr. Thomas came in 1948.
Yes,
right. That I think a lot of, especially the older generations here, look back to as kind of the heyday of the church. That's when things were happening the most. So, all right, so starting in 1948. How did that develop? What is the story of those years? What was that time like here at the church?
Well, in the country as a whole, it was just a huge. I mean, we won the war. It was very questionable whether we would. It was a two-front war, and so the fact that we won in both fronts, in both Europe and in Japan, I think just must have been very exciting. Women were very excited to be in the workforce at that point and be able to do that. Although at that point people wanted to go back, so there's some controversy about that. But many of the women who were here when I came, as older women, had pushed back and continued to work all through the 50s and 60s, and were had kids, worked, did the whole thing. And I think that's a whole other dynamic that began to enter our culture at some point, that if you're a woman, you don't just stay home and take care of the kids. So that all began then. The church began to produce both men and women missionaries in good number. And some of those we recognize, like we have Fletcher Lounge, named after Mary Fletcher. She sadly went to Africa, to the Congo, to be a missionary, and was not there more than about 3 months when she was in a car crash and died. So they named Fletcher Lounge after her. Dorothy Callick was another one who wanted to go, a young woman who was very interested in Nigeria. She was a nurse. There is nothing in Nigeria, and she was there at the very beginning of reaching out as a missionary with medical help there.
That's a name. I mean, that's a name I recognize. I mean, not just Fletcher from Fletcher Lounge, but Dorothy Callick. She was still alive when we merged the churches, right?
Yes, she was. Yeah, and she was here when I came, and She was actually still a missionary when I came, and
Wow.
we have been friends. We were friends until she passed away.
Oh my goodness.
Wonderful woman. She wanted to get married and have kids, but that was not going to be possible. So she passed that up to be a missionary as a single woman, basically all her life. Sweet, sweet lady, and a very good nurse, apparently, from what I understood. And many great stories. Sometimes we should do a podcast on her. She had amazing stories. Another one was Dorothy Wright, who wanted to go down into Mexico to Oaxaca, the Oaxaca area, and translate, make a translation of the Bible into Oaxacan. And so she was down there when I came, and I met her. I think she came up after about every 3 years to touch base with the church. I met her about twice before she retired, and as soon as she retired, basically she passed away. But I remember when her Bible was held up in the front of the pulpit and in front of the church and celebrated. She got it translated. So that was wonderful. Just a number of people like that. There's a guy named Tony Pizzotto who went to the Philippines. I mean, it just they just blossomed, went all over, and that was.
So I mean, I know you said that people were more aware of the world in those years, maybe even for the first time.
Yeah.
It seemed like the Lord was doing something really unique in those years, because it wasn't just one person.
No.
Or
it wasn't just one church.
No.
It was a big movement. Yeah. It was a very big outreach and very dynamic. And the exciting thing to me was that this church was kind of in the forefront of much of that with the group that was the church group that was forming that became what was called Conservative Baptist Association, coming out of the Northern Baptist. And Dr. Thomas was also a part of that. It was his father and he who began to try to put together a seminary to teach the Bible in a more conservative, if you will, way, that the Bible was the Word of God and was meant to be read straightforwardly. And so the Denver Seminary was started out of that, and Dr. Thomas's father was the first president of Denver Seminary, and then a few years later they started Western Seminary in Portland as well, same thing. So there is this kind of outreach beyond, not just overseas, but beyond the church here in this country, to create a different understanding of how you read and lived the Bible out, which is also, I think, very exciting.
Well, yeah, I mean that came out. Gosh, I'm trying to put that into like historical perspective. That came out of those are the years of the battle over inerrancy.
Yes.
Right. The questions on is the Bible actually true, and probably the most widespread attack on the truth and inerrancy of the Bible from kind of academic circles, casting doubt and things like that. And there was this pushback that then spawned all these, both missionaries spreading the gospel and institutions shaping and growing that. And it's fascinating that they were that directly connected to Denver Seminary, to Western Seminary, both formed out of that same heart to train and equip people with a conviction that the Bible, all of it, is actually true.
Yeah. I think that it's I wasn't here, but I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
I think there was courageous, and it took a lot of work, and a lot was done. The sense, I think, in the church also changed about women as missionaries, and that's when
that's striking. That's striking that these number of women missionaries being sent out.
Yes, and that was new. It was a controversial issue at the time. I think people were very protective, but the church had a different dynamic to it. There were women who really wanted to do this, were willing to forego marriage and the usual things that women did to do that, and a number of them. And so the church accommodated that. So in Africa, Europe, Far East, there were women missionaries, and in Central America that I think were outstanding, were brave, did really important things, and I think they were just as heroic as the men who went out. It's great.
We are gonna have to do a podcast, maybe something more than that, on the stories of some of these women. That would be it's incredible. It's striking to me, and it's interesting because I think that a lot of people experience, and maybe just on that specific topic, I think a lot of people experience the community here and the way in which women are both honored and upheld and respected, and as a change or a development from how they grew up in various places across the country or whatever. And so I think sometimes people can feel like there's Cornerstone is making this shift or something new or providing a new perspective. But I mean, even as you talk, I realize this isn't new to us as a church community. This has been what God's been doing here for decades.
Yes.
It's new oftentimes from where people come from.
Yes. And in the direction you might go.
Yeah.
But
But as far as this church community, it's the Lord. That's something the Lord's been doing here. I think
for decades.
Longer than we even realize.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting. Just this sense of initiative. I think that speaks to is very powerful. Churches that sit back and just with their congregation, that's it, versus this. And
it's not even one model for what womanhood looks like or how that plays out, but it was the fact that I'm sure back then there was a diversity. There were women who stayed home with their kids and women who, after the war, stayed at their jobs, and women who went to the mission field, and some that went to the mission field with their husbands, and some that went as single women. And it's the diversity of it that strikes me.
And other women professors, women business women who started businesses, less well known, more mundane, but financially supported the church and taught classes and brought college classes to the campus, and just a number of other aspects. I think the missionary one is probably the most spectacular in our minds because of that. But just a number of women who. That just changed the whole culture in many ways, and that came right into the church.
Okay, so that's fascinating to think of that as one of the things that characterized these years, this season in the life of the church, the missionary emphasis and the multiplication of people getting sent out, the establishment of some of these institutions, in the part that this local church played in that as a part of that movement, what became the Conservative Baptist movement. What else characterized this season? I mean, is it fair to call it the Dr. Thomas era? Should we?
I think that's what we called it. I think that's how people thought of it. It was. I think I would.
He was kind of the figurehead.
He was, and he was a dynamic figurehead.
Yeah.
I think you could say partially, maybe more than partially, it was the post-war era, and that would make sense. Housing sprung up and families moved here because housing. And then we had a follow-up to that. I'm getting a little ahead of this, but in the late 1950s, what happened was that all these people who bought houses here, and then the houses grew very quickly in value, sold the house and moved out to the valley. And so our membership rose quite high and then suddenly dropped quite low. Out of this social phenomenon of the West Side becoming the place to be, and the people selling their houses to get the money out of them and moving out to the valley.
These dynamics happened all the way back then.
Yeah.
Interesting. And probably just in these constant cycles. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's a lot going on the West Side. I think in the 50s and 60s and I think the dynamic at on campus at UCLA. And then Santa Monica College campus began to grow and get bigger. Was also, the whole era that came up with that.
I mean, it feels like, to me, this is anecdotal, but it feels like half the homes in West LA were built in the 50s.
Yes.
Right? I mean, I feel like, my house was built in the 50s. I keep talking to people in all sorts of different neighborhoods, and it was just, that's when this went from a agricultural area with kind of these hubs and towns to, was the sprawl in a sense, completed during that time, or when did this become feeling like a more more city, more town than country?
Yeah, I think it was kind of stop and go. There are areas that boomed, particularly near UCLA or near the coast. There were other areas that were less desirable. Culver City didn't fill in very quickly, but Culver City was mostly movie studios and movie sets. So as the land began to be desired for housing, they gladly sold off and moved out to the valley, or simply set up to do it. So it was very much in fits and starts in the area. But one of the factors that I noticed in reading the history of the church was that there was this boom and everybody started going to church and living around here, and then there was this selling off and people moving out to the valley, and suddenly the membership dropped. I mean, the membership at one point was 900 people in this church.
Oh my gosh!
I don't know how many services they had to have to satisfy that, but there were a lot of people in the church at one point, and then suddenly it dropped to about 300 or so over a period of 2 years. Not suddenly not like overnight, but with the change in the real estate. So and then it became expensive to live here, and then it was much more difficult, and then we began to get a more apartment population than a housing population. So all those sociological changes, and another one that happened. The racial issue became something that people began to look at. There were no black people in the church. It was mostly white people, but there were, oddly enough, Asian people. There was a kind of I don't know if you'd call it a reconciliation, but there was a kind of a welcome of people who were of Japanese background, having just fought a war with the Japanese. But then, there were a number of Japanese who had already been here, and they were taken out of the area at the beginning of the war, and people know about that. But many of them, including one fellow, was a good friend of mine named Tad Takuda, were in the camps up north, but they wanted to fight for America. They considered themselves American, even though they were ethnically Japanese. And finally, he was able to get permission to fight in Europe. And so he went and fought very valiantly in Europe and won medals, and was, I think, a very, very brave fighter. So these things these other issues were coming through the church, being felt here as much as anywhere else. You read about them in history, you think, yeah, that's interesting. But they were really major issues in the church and in the area. There were people who didn't like Tad because he was Japanese and didn't want to have him in the church. And he was kind of he was quite willing to pick a fight with anybody who wanted to challenge him. But he's a great man, and I was a friend of Tad's and loved him. Thought he was a great guy.
Yeah, I mean, that must have shaped the community here as they wrestled through their own iteration of the reconciliation the gospel provides.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
To say, what does it mean to be one church?
Yes.
Right. What does it mean over the? I think it's striking. It always feels like our generation's the one that has to deal with, these things, but it just takes different forms in each different generation or something.
Yeah. There's a black man who wanted to play the piano. Because he was black, they wouldn't let him play in the morning services, but they'd let him play in the evening service. And so he and a woman we should talk about named Addie Edens became the musicians for the evening service. She played the organ, he played the piano. They played them together. It was great music. He was a very quiet fellow, but
he wasn't allowed to play in the morning service.
He wasn't allowed to play in the morning service, just the evening service. But that you could see that change. People began to accept him more, and he became part of the congregation very gradually. And that allowed for other black people to feel welcome as well.
Was that a top-down transformation in the sense that Dr. Thomas or the leadership led the church in a direction, or was that a grassroots, like people's hearts were changing and it was manifesting, or do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, well, I would say it was complex because there were Dr. Thomas. My understanding, I didn't hear him say this, but my understanding was he insisted that he had the right to be here and be a participant in the service, but he kept it at a low level because he didn't want it to be a fight that the church had to fight. There were plenty of other fights to fight. That's what I heard. He never said that to me, but when I came, Dr. Huber was here, and he followed Dr. Thomas as the next pastor up. A terrible position to be in, right? An extremely popular pastor leaves, and you come in after him. But he really wanted this man to stay, and so he found a place for him. And occasionally he was allowed, or he was invited to play in the morning service, particularly when they couldn't get an organist or when Eddie wasn't available. So it became more comfortable. There was in the late 50s, there was a company in Hollywood who began filming church services at the various churches around, and they filmed one here. That I think has been lost since, but I saw a copy of that. And they rolled a camera down the center aisle of the church as the service was going on, and you could, every seat was taken, every seat was packed, all the way from front to back of the church. And there was a choir up in the choir loft, so it was just a whole mass of people. And if you look very carefully, you can see him. He's one of the singers in the choir. So there was just, I think, the beginning and the struggle with racial integration in the church. The younger generations, I think, not seeing why it was a problem, and the older generations having grown up with it and feeling uncomfortable. So I saw, I think, when I came, the remnants of that battle still around, but it was clearly in the post-war years, it was a struggle to figure out how we handle racial differences in this church.
And so, in a lot of ways, no one here was, in a sense, leading from up front, trying to push this forward. It was kind of a slow and steady, and in some sense dictated by people's developing comforts.
That's well said. Yeah, I think the war made a lot of changes.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that was they needed workers, and they didn't care what race they were. They wanted to know if you could handle a screwdriver and a I don't know, hacksaw or something. But that became I think the ground for connecting across racial lines that hadn't really been there before, or that had been class specific. So it was okay if your gardener was black or was brown or Japanese, but it wasn't okay if your neighbor was. And then that began to change, I think, through the war years and then post-war. And that I think the church kind of matched that. I don't think it got ahead of it, which makes me sad, but at least it began to work it through. So it totally is not an issue now. I mean, we don't even think about that, I think, as an issue. But when Tad Takuta came back from the camps, people were surprised to see him walk into the church, and so it was clearly the war had prejudiced people in some ways.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes me think of just probably for a long time how anyone who wasn't white probably had to fight a bit, even in terms had to deal with the biases and some really clear and overt, and probably lots more even subtle. That was a dynamic that existed here that people had to deal with for a long time, and probably, I mean, I don't know, but probably some remnants of that we,
have even
still feel.
Yeah, have even today. Yeah.
Yep, still feel.
Yeah.
And that people still feel. I think it's good. It's an important awareness.
Yeah.
We could talk about that more too. We talk about it in a lot of different settings, but so the church, in a lot of ways, it sounds like, actually followed and kind of reflected some of the journeying of the community, the ups and downs, the booms and busts in the community as well. When things became more, so you said, when things became more expensive, the church shrunk significantly.
Yes.
Because I imagine at that same time there was still an influx of people, right? Somebody was buying the houses that people were selling, but it was not the same type of community, or a community with the same that they weren't looking to. It wasn't a community that was looking to the church in the same way.
It seems not.
Okay.
I'm not sure what the sociological issue there. The people who were buying the houses were obviously people with a lot more money.
Yeah.
And moving into the West Side for different reasons: be close to the ocean, better drive to work.
We won't talk about the actual numbers that all these really expensive houses
we're going for.
But anyways, yeah, right. But yeah, so people were moving in and trying to be close to the ocean or closer to work. Was there still a lot of manufacturing?
Well, see, when was Santa Monica Freeway was built in the 60s, right? The early 60s.
Oh.
So I think that was just coming their way anyway.
But before that, you had to take a
Surface
2-lane service street basically over the Sepulveda Pass.
Yeah, if you're working in downtown LA, you had to drive there on surface streets.
Oh.
And unless you worked out here or I don't know, the 405 had been completed, right?
No, yeah,
no, I guess
didn't.
it hadn't. Okay, so you were kind of
70s?
stuck out here if you didn't. Yeah.
Interesting.
You had a long drive.
Yeah.
So unless you had a business here or you could phone it in, we didn't have email.
Were the studios a major employer at that point? Whether they were in Culver City or
and Culver
Universal.
City. Yeah, Culver City was a big area where,
exactly right.
But for the studios, and in the Valley they were too.
Mm-hmm.
My wife's parents, the land that where they bought their house, had been a back lot for one of the places that did Western movies all the time. So they can sometimes see The Rock in their backyard in a movie. So all that area began to change as the town grew, and the studios would sell off the land because it was more valuable to do that than it was to keep it for a back lot. Okay.
All right. Let me ask you an unfair question.
Okay.
How would you encourage us to think about this time? Because in one sense, it was historically unique in the post-war years, never to be duplicated again.
Yes.
And so it's hard to look back and be like, oh, let's emulate or try to get back there in one sense. In a second sense, so it's historically unique. Second of all, it was a very exciting time. The Lord was growing. He was deepening faith. People were coming to Christ, and the church was growing. And we're sending out missionaries. And it's a time to look back on, in one sense, with a lot of celebration for the salvation and long-term gospel work that came out of that season. At the same time, it was characterized by continued racism and ways in which the church wasn't leading the culture, but following along. And I think that it would be easy. It's tempting for me to pick one. Either make it this, glorious time and then try to get back there, to make it this horrible time that trumps everything else, or to make it this historically unique time that we can't learn anything from because it was so I'm tempted to run to the extremes or to pick one. And I'm curious how you look back on this time and how you would encourage us to to think about it, maybe even before you encourage us to. How do you feel about this time when you look back on
it? The war, I think, scared everybody half to death. Mm-hmm. I don't think that when Pearl Harbor was bombed, anybody thought that they were ready for a war. Mm. And I, as far as I can tell from both what people said to me and my own studies, and when I went to study this in my history classes, people were scared to death that this is the fight for their lives. Basically, they really did not think that they were going to necessarily it would be a slam dunk somehow. There was really a lot of fear and a lot of pushback on we've got to get together. We're coming out of the 30s, and everything's about me. I got to find a job somewhere. I got to figure out how to feed my family. And suddenly, it's not about me anymore. It's about the country. It's about how do we survive? How do we not be taken over? How do we got Germany over here and we got Japan over here, both of us trying to kill us off, basically. And I think there was a lot of fear, but the response to that was we have to work together. We have to be all on the same page. I can't be having my issues out there. I've got to shut up and get up and get going. And so there was this culture, I think, of during the war and following, we are like a giant team. Tell me what to do, and I'll go do it. And that's how the church operated and functioned under Dr. Thomas, by the way. And that's, I think, how our culture to some extent functioned. And then we got into Korea, and Korea was a war that didn't go well at all. It seemed a lot of issues, and people began to fray at the edges on the issue of we have to work together. And then we come into the 60s where everything, like, I don't want to do that, so I'm going to go off and do this. It became very much the opposite. The children of the war generation grew up to be people who say, I don't want to be in step with everybody else. I want to do my own step. And there was this huge cultural change. And I think that kind of killed off the idea of the church being somehow one unit, following a leader. It began to be, well, why can't we do this and why can't we do that? And why can't we do both? And so I think that the church followed a cultural change in our society. It was kind of a major shift. I grew up, post-war, not afraid of Pearl Harbor. None of that made anything to me. It's just a history lesson. But my dad told me about how he couldn't sleep nights worrying that his Japanese plane was going to fly over any minute now in Oklahoma and bomb him because it just looked so formidable and so scary, and they looked so powerful. So I think when I look at the church, I see this marching in step with the leader up until about the early 1960s or so at most. And about that time, it begins to change. And I think Dr. Thomas left just in time to avoid the critical part of that, the come down from everybody marching in lockstep to the general's commands. He's the general. And Dr. Huber comes in to a church that looks unified, but in fact is starting to be at war with itself. And so that change seems to me to be sad in one sense. I'm not sure that I don't want to think about how God felt about it, but the issue is, who are we before God at this time, and who are we at this time? And I think at any era, it may look very different in the way we assess God's will. And I think that it comes out of our society more than it comes out of the Bible sometimes.
It's so interesting. I think we'll get into the Hubert years next time, which is just a fascinating turn and change. I don't know if this is our world or if this is just human, but my heart longs for a simple, simplistic judgment of every era, every group, every time. I want to know whether these were the heroes that we should try to follow, or the failures that we need to make up for, or the I want to make it simple. And what I constantly in every season, and this is just you in life, but what I hear you saying is that this was a large, complex group of people that the Lord used to do some incredible things during that season, who are also deeply flawed and deeply afraid.
Yes.
And the Lord was gracious enough to, even in Dr. Thomas, I either want him to be a hero leader that I should try to be like, or someone whose example I reject. I want him to be either. But life and humans don't work like that.
Right. That's what I see.
and I hear you highlighting that over and over, kind of from every different angle.
Yeah, I think Dr. Thomas was a great man, a strong leader, the right leader for that time. And when he handed it off, he knew he was no longer the right leader. That's what he told me. I came after him after he had resigned. Oddly enough, Dr. Huber, who took over from him, had only been here about a year when I started attending. But when I first met Dr. Thomas, he said, "Yeah, I've been following you. I know about you and how you came to church and what you've been doing here." And I thought, I don't even know you. What do you mean you're following me? But he had kept an interest in the church. He knew more about me than Dr. Huber did. And Dr. Huber was a great guy. But Dr. Huber was struggling with the church because the church was breaking up. And he was trying to figure out how to hold it together until he figured out he couldn't, and that he had to move with a church that was in a different era.
What a unique time. What a unique time in the history of our country.
Indeed.
What a unique moment in the history of our city. And particularly this part of the city. And I guess it only makes sense then, what a unique moment in the life of the church. What a unique season in the life of the church. It's that nuanced, complicated history. In your retelling of it, it sounds like the Bible to me. It sounds like the story of God's people forever. It sounds like, we're just starting Corinthians. It sounds like the church at Corinth. Right? Who were filled with these genuine believers, and the Lord was doing amazing things, and there were some really major things they were missing. But Paul loved them. Cared for them, was optimistic about them, knew they could grow. And that God would use them for his glory, and that they could grow and become more like him. I think similarly, we want our generation to be the one that got it right. And fear missing something. And we should strive to address all the things we can see and that are within our power, and all the injustices. But there's also a humility that comes when we realize that we're our story's more like that than it's not. That there are things God's going to do for his glory in our midst, and it's not going to be because we were so great or so smart or so spiritual, but that he works through us and in spite of our failings.
Well, and I think that if we think about it, hopefully it teaches us to say, okay, I need to have one eye on where we are and one eye on where I begin to hand off the congregational change people. It's not very good. To someone who's more connected into that, because it may be that I'm not the one who continues to do this ministry in that camp, with the mindset that I have with the people I've been working with. That was complicated, but I hopefully you get something of that. That's one thing that I think churches get stuck in a generation and think this is the right way to do it, rather than saying, okay, every generation has a right way to do it that may not look the same. Same Bible, same God, but the ministry has to change form somehow. And I think churches often stumble over that. I'm talking to a man right now who's trying to redo a church and pretty much lost all of his congregation, but is now developing a new congregation because of that issue. It's the cultural. It wasn't the Bible. It was the culture. And I just think, how do we miss that? Yeah.
Well, that's helpful. Thanks, Jim.
Scary, but
it is, and it's, I think that there's all sorts of ways, and I'm sure there's many more stories you could tell from that era.
Every era.
But I think it's a really helpful perspective, both in how we view this church and its life during that era, and also then how we view ourselves as moments, as links in that chain. Yeah. Any last stories from the Thomas era you wanted to make sure you told that we haven't gotten to?
Dr. Thomas kept track of the church and what was going on, and I was not ever here when he was the head pastor, but he would come and visit. And the funny thing to me was he would take me aside and talk to me. I was not even on church staff. I was a new believer in the church. And he would take me aside and talk to me. And he knew all about me. And I thought, you're a wonderful man to pay attention to me. And I want to honor him and say, there's ways in which you're not the main man right now. You're not the main pastor. But that doesn't mean you can't touch base with people and speak into the lives. And I delighted in him for doing that. And I just want to honor him that way.
That's sweet. Appreciate that. What a gift.
Yeah. What a man! What a guy!
Yeah, absolutely. And what a fascinating season in the life of, like we said, the country and the church.
Yeah,
so
indeed.
Well, thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. We look forward to part 4. We'll dive into the Huber years.
The Huber years, yeah.
And
that was wild. It was a rodeo.
Only gets more interesting, huh?
It only gets more crazy. Yep, indeed.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you look forward to that as much as I do, and we'll get to that in the next few weeks. So, in the meantime, know we love you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Sunday.
See ya.